decline in absolute terms in at some levels of skills, and the share of returns to physical and human capital rise. And of course, this is the modern assembly line. The first time we saw this was actually probably already 15 years ago in a Toyota factory in Japan, where it was quiet, clean, and there just wasn't a person anywhere. And they were making, the cars were coming out, and the robots were quite clever because the first car was this make, and then the next one on the very same line was two-door, and then four-door, and then an SUV, and everything was already, probably 10 or 15 years ago, almost completely roboticized in this core industrial sector. So that's a first part of what has happened, is that income inequality has risen. Now, the second phenomenon, the third phenomenon on the list is that migration has exacerbated the economic changes. I think my slides may be out of order, so that'll shorten my talk also. One thing for us to understand is how this anti-migrant populism, which we're experiencing, is embedded in major demographic change that is underway. And in the United States, for example, what is shown here is the really dramatic rise of the immigrant population in the United States over the last 50 years. What happened in the US was that at the end of the 19th century, we had a mass migration, mainly from Eastern and Southern Europe. So there was a huge inflow from the 1880s to World War I. By the way, none from Asia, because the first racial laws in the US outside of Africans and Native Americans was to keep Chinese out. So we had an Immigration Act in the 1880s, the China Exclusion Act, to keep Chinese out of the United States. But there was relatively open migration in the 1890s and then in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Then there was a backlash. The population of foreign-born reached about 15% of the total. There had been a huge surge of migration. And in 1924, we had an anti-immigration backlash. The borders were basically closed, and quotas were put on at a small level, where the quotas were all basically for Northern Europeans, Germany north. And Hitler was a great admirer of this law, this 1924 immigration law. He praised it in Mein Kampf, that you see a country that finally got its act together to understand the need for limiting migration. There was a lot of racism, a big backlash against the Jewish migration from Eastern Europe, a backlash against Italian migration, peasant migration from Eastern and Southern Europe. And so the borders were kind of closed in 1924, not fully, but the quotas were dramatically reduced and saved for Northern Europe, essentially. And that remained that way in the United States until the 1960s. And the share of the foreign-born in the US population fell from about 15% to under 5%. And that was a period, migration was just not an issue during that period. The politics had closed it down. The migrant population was declining as a share of the overall population. Our issues were racial issues between white and African American population, but not with the dimension of migration. Then in 1965 was the first immigration law since 1924. So 40 years later, Lyndon Johnson passed a migration law which essentially raised the quotas and opened it up for family reunification and for other criteria other than country of origin. And that enabled a massive migration of Hispanic population into the United States. And the Hispanic population rose from something like 2% of the American population in 1960, maybe 3%, to around 15%. That's our drama of demographic change. Europe's is different. You have a migration from the Middle East, you have an East Europe to Western Europe migration, you have migration from Africa. Ours is a Hispanic migration during this period. And it led to, from a social and demographic point of view, quite a significant change. That red line here, this is, sorry, I wasn't pointing. The red line here is the percent of the population. So you see it rose till around 1900, then came this 1924 Act. It fell to about 5%, and we're on this path now. The blue line is the absolute number of non-native born Americans, rising to about 45 million out of 325 million. It's a little surprising to me, but maybe it shouldn't be so surprising, that 15% becomes quite a sociological reality. Of course, it's very high in some places, much higher than that, especially in the cities and in the West United States. But there seems in America to be a kind of 15% threshold over the last century that when it reaches that level, that's tension. And we're in that level right now. And it is the result of changes that were made and then amplified by the fact that a lot of visitors came. Nothing was very much policed. Business tends to like the low-wage Hispanic labor and hires it, so visas are not enforced and haven't been. People settle down. They're undocumented, so it's people without legal rights to stay, but have been in the country 10 or 20 years. And this is a lot of the drama, and Trump played on all of this quite in an ugly manner and quite successfully. This is a similar picture of the percent of the foreign-born in Britain. It's interesting. It doesn't follow exactly the same pattern, but you see that from the 1960s onward, it's almost the same sharp rise from about 5% of the population to about 15% of the population. For many other countries of Europe, you have the same phenomenon. So all of the tensions that we're facing right now are within a context, obviously. And then came the Syrian refugee crisis, which to my mind was very difficult for multiple reasons. First, it was a surge of population, of course. Second, it was Europe simply on the receiving end of a disaster. And by the way, an American-caused disaster as far as I'm concerned. This is something that we could discuss, but I think the Syrian war basically was a U.S. concoction. That's not how it's usually told. It's usually told that it's an internal rebellion. No doubt Assad is one of the worst bastards on the planet, but the rebellion, such as it was armed and fomented and amplified dramatically by Saudi Arabia and the United States. And that is really what caused the massive migration. We turned a repression into a war, into a regional war. Europe has almost no foreign policy right now, so the debate in Europe was not what to do about Syria, the debate was what to do about refugees. And under international law, it is to receive them. And that has been the decent, very decent approach in Europe. But it is politically extraordinarily difficult, obviously, I don't have to tell you. And there are many reasons for it being difficult. One is how big the numbers are in very short term. They're not overwhelming, but in short term, they're huge for the short size of this. And second, the politicians seem to have no answer. When does it stop? Is this ongoing? Is this one time? And I think that that makes the politics of this incredibly difficult because the answer, we must be nice, is not really an adequate political answer. There has to be a better answer than that. Being nice is a wonderful answer, but it's not a full political answer. And there needs to be migration policy and foreign policy, and there hasn't been. And this I just clipped as the big surge of population in just 1 year, where in Sweden it was a rise of 1.5% of the population, and in Austria 1.1% of the population. And that's a sociological and political reality that's quite dramatic. So I think that this is definitely another context of this anti-populism. For Europe, there's an even bigger issue, which I find very important to understand, and that is the long-term demography of Europe and its neighborhood, if I could call it that. In 1950, Europe had twice the population of the Middle East and Africa combined. So Europe was not only, well, that was the end of World War II, but it was not only the industrialized, rich West, but it was also the populous part of the region. The Middle East was not highly populated, and Africa, it's hard to remember, but today Africa has 1 billion people in the sub-Saharan region. It's got about 1.3 billion people total, 1.2 billion people if you add in North Africa. But at the time, in 1950, sub-Saharan Africa had only 180 million people. The Middle East, only about 200 million people. Europe, depending on which Europe you define, somewhere between 500 and 600 million. So Europe was populous, and the neighborhood looked not empty, but not like a crisis. If you then move forward for 65 years, Europe is now half the population of Africa and the Middle East. Europe is something on the order of, I took a broad definition of Europe, including Eastern Europe and European and Russia, actually, in this number, 700 million people. And Africa plus the Middle East is now 1.5 billion people. So Europe was twice the population, now it's half the population. That's got to make people nervous in such a context of migration. Europe's the rich center, but now it faces twice the population in its southern and eastern side, and no clear policy about that. And if you look forward in kind of mechanistic projections of demography, Africa's population is soaring right now. Soaring. Completely dysfunctionally soaring. And the reason is that in poor countries, the kids finish school at age 12 or age 14. The girls do not go to secondary school. They're married at 14. They're starting to have children at 15 or 16. They don't have market skills, and their fertility averages around 5 children per woman in Africa now, in sub-Saharan Africa. And if you think about that, that means the population is tending to double every generation. Now, the fertility rate is coming down very gradually because secondary education's rising very slightly. But if you extrapolate, as the UN does, the UN's projection for sub-Saharan Africa is 4 billion people by 2100. The UN's forecast for Europe, by the way, is about 500 million, down by about 200 million because of low fertility rates. So Europe's population has peaked and is gradually declining. Africa's population is on a track, according to the UN's medium forecast, to rise 4 times. The Middle East is still increasing in population, but not as fast. And so if you look at Europe compared to, as I called it, the neighborhood, Europe was twice the neighborhood in 1950. Now it's 1/2 your neighborhood. And by 2100 on this prediction, it's 1/10 the neighborhood. That's good for some sleepless nights, by the way. For real reason, not some awful reasons. For real reasons, because 4 billion people in Africa means a lot of poverty and a lot of mass migration and a lot of suffering and a lot of difficulty. There's a very good solution to it. Bruno Kreisky would have known it immediately, and that is help make sure that every child in Africa gets an education. And if you just did that, the fertility rates would decline dramatically. I can't tell you how many times I've said that sentence in the last 10 years, at least 1,000 times to government officials. It doesn't matter. We're paralyzed, incapable of doing anything useful in this world these days. So Europe has no strategy at all in the face of this. And that means a rise of anti-globalization, right-wing, anti-immigrant populism. That's another factor in this whole story. What's happening as a result of this is not good. It's not good economically, and it's not good politically. Economically, we're really seeing, and the U.S. is a stark example because we have a libertarian mindset. You were good to give us Schumpeter, but not so good to give us Hayek, by the way.
We were good, you had it.
Exactly. This was a mistake. We took on libertarianism. It is a god-awful mess of an idea. It's so primitive, you would tell your 6-year-olds that's not how to behave. But this is actually what we even call a philosophy in the United States. And even a fourth-rate novelist like Ayn Rand is called a philosopher in America. But then again, Donald Trump is called a president. So it's all very confusing in categories. But we haven't resisted these market forces, and so the inequality has widened now for 35 years. And what I'm showing you here are the earnings at different education levels. The top line is if you have an advanced degree beyond a bachelor's degree. So it's a master's or a PhD degree or medical or legal or business advanced degree. Okay, for those, life couldn't be better. This is a boom time. technological improvements, people with the advanced educations, especially technical skills. This has been a marvelous period economically. Huge increases of living standards, unimaginable prosperity. The bottom line is if you don't even have a high school diploma, and then it grades below high school, some college, and bachelor's degree. And what you see in this picture is that bachelor's and up, that's four-year university and up, have done well in rising living standards. Some college and less have seen falling absolute earnings in the United States. Earnings peaked for those with a high school diploma 40 years ago in real terms. There are, by the way, definitional problems about comparing real incomes over a 40-year period, so I don't want to make too much of absolutes, but I do want to emphasize the relative aspects here. We've had a huge widening according to skill levels. If you are working class, high school graduate, you used to be a middle class American and a middle class voter. You were probably a John F. Kennedy voter. But now you're poor. You're not in the middle class. You're in a fragile work environment. Your wages have gone down. You can't pay your kids' college education, no way. And in America, you pay for college. It's not paid for by the state. We don't have social democracy. We have Ayn Rand. And so the difference is you end up with working class kids with high levels of student debt that don't even finish their degree. And one of the small footnotes about American labor market is that having some college is basically worthless compared to having a college degree. Because when you go in to become a barista at Starbucks, it's not good enough to have 3 years of college. You have to have your bachelor's.